I'd like to talk today about why California seems to have a chronic budget problem. Most of you know that California has had deficits in its general fund budget for the last few years, and we seem to have a great deal of difficulty in getting out of that situation. There are a number of reasons why we seem to have this problem and why it's so difficult to get rid of it. In arithmetic terms, the simple reason why we have a budget deficit is that we take in less revenue than we spend. But that's just the arithmetic. The question is why we don't correct that situation. There are some answers that are perhaps longer run fundamental type answers, and some that might at least help us get out of that problem if we were able to resolve them. Let me talk about two issues, one a historical issue and one an ongoing problem that I think we could correct fairly simply. The historic issue really goes back to the 1970s, and many of you know that during the 1970s we passed something called Proposition 13. Proposition 13 put tight limits on property taxes, and it led the state government to bail out local governments that had earlier been dependent on those property tax revenues. The question is, why did we pass Prop 13? The answer seems to be partly that property taxes were going up so much that people felt that they just had to do something about it, and the legislature didn't seem to be able to act. And partly because there had been changes in the way in which people viewed the government in that era. Up through the mid-1960s, California was an expanding economy. We were building freeways, we were building new campuses for the university and for the state colleges. We were building new water projects. Growth was on the agenda. And people knew that you had to pay something for these projects. And throughout California history, here in Los Angeles, for example, we had the Owens Valley Project and later the Colorado River Project. All of these had to be paid for in one way or another, but people did pay for them, and they got the services that they expected. So there was a notion that you pay, but you get. Somewhere in the 1970s, that perception changed. Property taxes were going up, and people said, well, property taxes, that's for things that relate to local government. If my property tax doubled, did that mean that the police, the fire, the sanitation, the street maintenance, all of that had doubled in quality over that period? And particularly, did the schools double in quality? In fact, in that era, it seemed like that not only was that not happening, but by many measures there was a deterioration in some of those services. So people got the sense that you pay and you don't get, and once you have that embedded in the public consciousness, it's very difficult to go to them and say, hey, we've got a budget problem, let's raise this or that tax to deal with it. People went in the other direction with Prop 13 and some other initiatives that came along thereafter. So that, I think, is a very fundamental element in our budget problem, and one that's not so easy to correct. People would have to get a sense over a period of time that they get when they pay, and that calls for a lot of responsibility in government to make sure that that happens. There is another factor that I think would help us perhaps in a shorter term context in terms of repairing our budget, and that is to make our budget accounting much more transparent, much more consistent. One of the things that I've discovered is when I say to people budget deficit, and I say, what does that mean to you? Well, they say, well, that means that we're getting less revenue than we're spending. That's the common sense usage of that term. That's what we mean when we say the federal government is running a deficit. That's exactly what we mean there. But it turns out, if you look at state budget language, that that's not what we mean at the state level. Sometimes we mean that. Sometimes we mean something else. Sometimes we're talking about flows of revenue. Sometimes we're talking about the stock, how much we've got in our general fund as a reserve at any point in time, you'll find that budget documents sometimes use the word deficit in more than one way on the same page. Well, if that's the case, if we don't have a standard set of accounts and budget terminology, how do we expect our state legislatures, how do we expect the general public, how do we expect the news media that cover issues in Sacramento, how do we expect local officials that depend ultimately on the state for their support to understand precisely what's going on in Sacramento and what they can expect in the way of revenues and expenditures? If we don't have standard terminology, we can't make good decisions. We're not guaranteed that if we have proper terminology, we'll make good decisions, but it's pretty clear that if we don't have that terminology in place, people don't have a common sense understanding of the state budget, and policymakers don't have a common sense understanding of the state budget, we're not going to make much headway. The basic problem with our budget language, and there are many, but the basic one that I want to call to your attention is that we seem to use the word revenue to include borrowing. Nobody in the corporate sector, nobody at the federal level would say that money that you're getting from borrowing, whether it's borrowing from Wall Street or borrowing from some other fund within the government, is a source of revenue. And indeed, if you say that borrowing is revenue, you by definition always have a balanced budget, because if you're spending more than you're taking in taxes, you must be borrowing the money somehow in order to pay your bills. By the definition that revenue and borrowing are one and the same thing, the federal government has a balanced budget and pretty much has always had a balanced budget. So if people are told that we have a balanced budget when in fact we are operating at a deficit, they'll think, well, there's no problem. And that's what they've been told repeatedly in recent years, that somehow the budget, we may have had a problem last year and maybe we're going to have some problems in the future, but right now the budget is balanced. And when you tell people that, they have a sense that there is no problem to correct, and therefore there is nothing that they should be doing, nothing that their elected officials should be doing to deal with that problem. So I think if we can first work on just having good budgetary methodology and terminology, that will help us make some good decisions. And if we can make some good decisions, maybe we can restore public trust in the sense that when you pay your taxes, you get your services. And once we've done that, then I think we can stop having the chronic budget deficits that we've had in California. I'd like to show you a chart that shows our annual budget from the mid-1970s up through the present time, and even projecting a little into the future. What you'll observe here is that in some years we've had budget surpluses, particularly in the late 1990s when we were getting lots of capital gains revenue because the stock market was going up and people were cashing in their stock options and just making money in the stock market. And other times we've had deficits. What you'll notice is that when we look at the current budget year, the year that we're in, this is 2005-2006 fiscal year, the budget deficit seems to contract. It's still negative, but not greatly negative, and seems to be less negative than it was before. But thereafter, it sort of pops up again, and we've got budget deficits out into the future. This is an illustration of the tendency to make corrections or seeming corrections in our budget that, at least on paper, bring us toward a balanced budget, but in fact simply defer liabilities into the future. So one of the things that we really have to work on is not just worrying about the budget this year, but about what is often referred to as the structural budget and the structural deficit. Structural deficit is a concept that says if the economy grows at a normal pace, what will happen to our budget if we keep bringing in revenue and expending our resources as we have been doing in the past? And as you see, what we have is a chronic structural deficit. So that means that economic growth by itself is not going to get us out of our current dilemma. We have to rely on something else. The something else would either have to be reductions in expenditures over the long term, or an increase in revenue, which is going to be done only by raising taxes. People always like to talk about an increase in revenue without saying that that means an increase in taxes, but that's what it means. So you're going to need one or the other, or some combination of both, ultimately, to resolve our current structural deficit.